Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. Aloha, and welcome to the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum's webinar series, where we discover and investigate a range of topics, including aviation, aeronautic innovation, World War II Pacific theater history, and more. Today, June 4th, we are commemorating the legendary Battle of Midway. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Our museum is located in the state of Hawaii on historic Ford Island, right at the very center of the famous Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. It is our museum's mission to steward the history of America's first aviation battlefield of World War II. Before we begin, I'd like to alert our viewers about the chat and the Q&A capabilities here on Zoom. We are so excited to have guests from around the world. So if you could just take a moment and in the chat and let us know where you are viewing from. We're happy to have you. While you participate, we welcome comments, questions, or historical observations that you might have. However, please be respectful and courteous and kind to everyone who is participating as well. Behind the scenes, we also have museum educators who are ready to address any general questions that you have. We are joined today by two highly qualified individuals to share their insight on this epic battle. Today's moderator and host of his own podcast, Figments, The Power of Imagination, is retired Air Force General Dan Figleaf, and of course, our guest speaker, author of Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, and naval historian, Jon Parshall. General Leaf, welcome to the webinar. And Jon, welcome back. It's your second time here.
Yes, nice to see everybody.
Yeah, okay. So I'm so happy that you both are here today. General Leaf, I leave everyone in your capable hands and we can get started. All right.
Thank you, Ashley. Thanks, and aloha, everyone. Before we start, let me just say that Jon and I have had the pleasure of talking about this for hours since we connected for this webinar, and it should be a lively conversation, at times lighthearted, but please understand that we appreciate the solemn nature of the memories of the Battle of Midway, and we're not making light of it, but it's been wonderful to get to know Jon and tap into his expertise. I don't think there is a more revered scholar on the Battle of Midway, and he knows it all. And if I make any mistakes, he'll be sure and let me know, won't you, Jon?
Appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So one of the questions that I ask myself, because there have been so many movies and TV documentaries and books, including yours, about Midway, is why is it so popular, if you will? What is it that makes Midway special to those who study World War II history and those who just are interested in subjects like that?
Yeah, I think that, if you sort of look at the pantheon of great battles in American military history, you'd have to put Midway in the top 5 or 6 or so. It certainly ranks up there with things like D-Day and Battle of the Bulge, Pearl Harbor. I think what makes it so interesting even now is that it is such a momentum changer within the context of the Pacific War. You have to put yourself back in the mindset of what it was like to be in the middle of 1942, where the first 6 months of the Pacific War has just been disastrous for the Allies. And so for the Americans to kind of, check the momentum of the Japanese and seemingly begin to turn things around was an amazingly momentous happening. And that is why it gets so much attention. Midway also then leads to a whole bunch of follow-on events. It directly leads to the campaign down in Guadalcanal, which is also critically important to the outcome of the war.
I think obviously that's a lot to digest, but also there are some pretty remarkable personalities, and it's a battle that the discussion is often defined by personalities. As you said, it's the clear and present danger. I said that, but sort of summarizing yours, if we could see slide 2, you talked about the fact that it was in the Central Pacific and enabled the turn south. And actually, if we could bring up slide 2, the map there, we'll see that. But this was pretty close to Hawaii. This was not some abstract threat.
Yes.
And while the policy of the United States and the Allies was Europe first, Germany first, in reality, many of the assets by both need and availability went to the Pacific. The Japanese had to be stopped, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you can see in this map that by the time we get to Midway, the Japanese have carved out from themselves, one of the largest empires in the history of man. And the attack at Midway was a deliberate attempt to get a foothold in the Hawaiian island chain to begin moving down that chain towards an eventual invasion of Oahu. So a very important place to stop them.
Right. And at an important time, if we look at slide 3, we'll see the timeline of the Pacific War. And it's not complete. Okay, I built this. Me and my PowerPoint skills built this. Yep. But it really was the pivotal point and enabled what followed, and also eventually, to some degree, enabled the true shift of assets and resources that were relevant to the European theater.
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to point out on your slide here what you see in the first 6 months of this war is that a lot of things have gone very badly wrong for the Allies, yes. Starting with the invasion of Hong Kong, the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. By the time you get to about March, April of 1942, the Japanese have captured Malaya, Singapore, most of Burma, all of the Philippines, all of Java. It's been a real disaster. So there's lots going on at the beginning part of the war.
And yet, this always strikes me when you look at the timing of the Doolittle raid, Battle of Coral Sea, the U.S. is able to take some initiative early on, really early on. Having participated in a couple of conflicts, I'm surprised at the rapid transition to offensive operations is maybe too simple, I'd say, to operations where it was our initiative.
Right. Yeah, well, and to your point, when we start talking about some of the personalities in the battle, when we talk about Admiral King, who's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, and also Admiral Nimitz, who's the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, one of the tenets of U.S. naval doctrine was centered around aggressive action to restore situations. And so even though the assets that we had available to us at the beginning of the war were not sufficient to really drive deeply into Japanese territory, we were certainly doing things like doing carrier raids around the perimeter just to try to keep them off balance.
Yeah, and the level of preparation or investment commitment was evident on Midway Island. If we could go to slide 4, which is not just one island, there are actually 3, a little island called Spit, I think, and then the 2 major islands. One at the top of the slide is a seaplane base, and the bottom of fixed wing real runways air base, and millions of dollars invested, right?
Yeah, which back in the day was real money. The seaplane base had cost $20 million back in 1940 to put together. By the time we get to the Battle of Midway, which happens on 4 June, those 2 islands have got the better part of 3,000 to 4,000 Marines on them, along with base personnel and so forth. They are very heavily defended locales, a lot of anti-aircraft, a lot of shore batteries, et cetera, et cetera.
As an aside, have you ever been to Midway?
No, I have not.
I have.
Have you?
Actually, yeah. And transiting the Pacific, one of the gazillion times I transited the Pacific, yes. Yeah. You need to get there. We had an early question that somebody asked if you could travel there. According to my research assistant, Google, you can travel to Midway.
Really?
Yeah.
Man, I don't know. Last time I was out in Hawaii, they were taking a couple of Midway veterans up to the island. This was for the 75th anniversary, but I was not invited along there because, of course, it's mostly a wildlife sanctuary at this point.
Right.
The most reliable way to get there, as far as I know, is to have some sort of an engine problem on your airliner that requires an emergency divert to the airfield. So,
well, I flew mostly single and 2-engine fighters on my many ocean crossings, and I'm not willing to have an engine problem for anybody. Just visit. So, John, let's set the table now for the battle. If we could go to slide 5. Your book came at the matter from a Japanese point of view, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So slide 5 will show the overall theater balance of power, and the Japanese had it made.
Yeah.
Look at that. Look at that. My God, we're totally outnumbered.
Totally outnumbered. And that's one of the central myths around the battle that our book tried to dispel. Was almost since the day of the battle, there has been this notion that the Americans fought against overwhelming odds to win this battle. And it is true that if you look at the number of Japanese ships that were in the Pacific doing something vaguely related to this particular battle on the morning of 4 June, yes, there were quite a number of ships. But if you take away all of the formations that are up in the Aleutians, which was sort of a sideshow, along with, the support forces, the invasion forces, the main body, which had all the battleships that was trailing 600 miles behind the carriers, if you take all of those away and we go to the next slide.
Yep, slide 6.
What you'll see is that at the point of the spear, in immediate contact on the morning of 4 June were these groups of ships. And basically you've got 20 warships on the side of the Japanese and 24, 25 on the side of the Americans. The Americans have got 3 aircraft carriers, but they have an island that has an airbase that obviously can't be sunk, and the Japanese have 4 of their carriers. So that's the basic force structure, who's going to be going toe-to-toe on the morning of 4 June.
And we're fortunate to have that order of battle. I think the Japanese had some uncertainty about the actual carrier availability. Next slide. Part of that was the Yorktown being repaired dramatically. We talked in our preparation for this. If I could be witness to one element of the Battle of Midway, it would be the repair of the Yorktown in Pearl Harbor.
And just by way of background for our listeners, the Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea during the early part of May and had limped back to Pearl Harbor, where she was desperately needed for this battle that was now shaping up off of Midway. They put her into dry dock, and basically they had 72 hours to put the ship back into fighting trim of some sort and get her patched up and back out to sea so she could make it up to the battle. It's an incredible feat.
I can only imagine the activity, and it actually steamed out inside 72 hours with civilian shipyard workers still repairing the ship.
Yeah.
Wow. It must have been just incredibly frenzied activity. We also had some good fortune in that we had an air group that might not have been available from the Saratoga, right? Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, we have
the air order of battle.
A question about that. Yes, Saratoga's air group was actually put onto the Yorktown prior to the battle because Yorktown had taken casualties at Coral Sea in some of her earlier operations. And so Yorktown is operating a fair number of Saratoga's pilots. From a organizational standpoint, this shows you some of the flexibility that the U.S. Navy had in being able to view their air groups and their composite squadrons as really being sort of cookie cutter. And, I can take them off on one ship and put them on another and, pretty much locked and loaded, they're ready to go. You contrast that to the inflexibility of the Japanese, who viewed the carrier and its air group as 2, integral pieces of the same thing. The Japanese could have brought another carrier with them to the Battle of Midway, the Zuikaku, but her air group had been shot to pieces at Coral Sea, and they did not feel inclined to put together a composite group composed of her survivors and those from her sister ship, Shokaku. And the result is that they didn't have that carrier. So this picture of Yorktown under repair also gives you a sense for just which of these 2 teams, if you will, wanted the win more. I mean, we are moving heaven and earth to get Yorktown back into this fight, whereas the Japanese are not doing that same level of effort to get Zuikaku there.
Yeah, from my perspective and my experience, I'm not sure that was a matter of desire perhaps it was a matter of hubris on the part of the Japanese, because they've been doing pretty well, as you detailed. But the Japanese had a numerical superiority, some degree, not as large as thought. Certainly had greater combat experience.
Yep.
The U.S. had the advantage of the flexibility, and as a Air Force fighter pilot, we always say flexibility is the key to air power. So we had that. We had our battle damage repair capabilities,
yep,
which were much better than the Japanese, probably because we had more practice at it, right? And I think that was very important.
Yeah, yes, there was definitely an emphasis on the U.S. Navy in survivability, whereas the Japanese tended to not worry so much about habitability, protection, and survivability. They were all focused on offense on their warships, and it kind of bit them in the butt.
And then another advantage that isn't talked about too often that the U.S. had was its fleet availability of radar as a warning tool for air attacks, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So at this point in the war, radar is still pretty primitive stuff, but
right.
The Americans are learning in some cases from their own experience, but also they're taking in some of the teachings of the British as well, who have just fought the Battle of Britain not too long ago, and are starting to assemble not only the technological pieces, but the doctrinal and human pieces to use radar to do things like vectoring fighters out to, intercept incoming raids. And that's a technique that is very difficult to master, and yet we're going to be able to do it reasonably well at the Battle of Midway, and the Japanese don't have that.
So we've got our first live question. I only bring that up to encourage others to submit it. And I'd point out one that we will get to is from ancestor of a participant in the battle. Says, my father was in VMSB 241.
Yep.
And we had a couple of those in our earlier submissions of questions. And I'd just like to honor all of your kin who participated, served, and thank them for their service and sacrifice. So go ahead, John.
I was going to say, in reference to that, this is a battle that is typically portrayed as the U.S. Navy's fight, but in actuality, if you look at, who is on the island of Midway, potentially facing up to an invasion, what you find is that, first of all, there's a composite air group there that, as our attendee pointed out, does have a couple of different Marine squadrons, a squadron of dive bombers and a squadron of fighters. There's a group of B-17s from the Army Air Force. There's also a quartet of Army medium bombers. On the ground, you've got Marines as well as naval personnel. So, there were a lot of people from a lot of different services in harm's way that morning.
And as always, it's a team effort.
Yeah.
Let's talk about people for a bit. And we could spend the rest of these on any of the pictures that are about to come up, because the people are so fascinating and so important to it. First, on the Japanese side, the two key leaders were Admiral Yamamoto. If we could go to slide 8, Admiral Yamamoto and Admiral Nagumo. Nagumo, the on-scene commander, if you will, and Yamamoto, the big boss. What would you have people know about these two and their role in the battle in brief summary, which is difficult?
Yeah, Yamamoto is the commander-in-chief of Combined Fleet, so he is the big kahuna when it comes to the Japanese Navy. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor. He's a very audacious planner. He was quite a good bureaucratic infighter as well. A proponent of naval aviation, but also very keen to preserve his battleships, which was a problem when they got down to the Guadalcanal campaign. So a very interesting figure. Also someone who actually knew a great deal about the United States because he had lived here. Nagumo is sort of an odd duck to be in command of what is the most powerful carrier force on the planet at this point in time. He was a cruiser commander. He's a torpedo expert. But for reasons of seniority alone, he ends up getting put in command of what's called First Air Fleet in April of 1941. And he really didn't have a good affinity for the carrier as a weapons system. And as a result, he ends up having to sort of lean on his staff officers to help him out. Um, and I look at Nagumo actually as something of a tragic figure, a guy who was a little bit out of his element and who actually fought the battle reasonably well. He fought it by the book. Unfortunately, the book was a very thin book at this point because battles, we haven't done them before, right? And so he fought by the book and ended up not doing well, doing disaster.
And in the fog of war, there is a trite phrase that doesn't begin to describe what I think I've experienced in my combat time. But man, every moment lost trying to figure out what the heck just happened entails risk. And I wouldn't say I'm sympathetic, but this was a very confused and lengthy battle, as we'll see. The one other Japanese player is next slide, please. Is Reverend. Later, he became an evangelist in the U.S. And this is an interesting story, folks. I'll refer you. Just Google the heck out of this guy and have it several grains of salt ready because it's an interesting history. But Fujita, who had been the lead at Pearl Harbor, and who wound up post-battle being a source for many historical examinations of the battles. What can you say in 1 minute or less? Because I know we could go on forever on Fujita.
Fujita is an incredibly important figure in Pacific War history because, as you say, he wrote a number of books. He was Akagi, which is the flagship at the battle. He was her air group leader. He was the attack leader at Pearl Harbor. And so obviously an incredibly important witness to a number of important events. He writes some books after the war, including one of the most important sources on the Battle of Midway. And unfortunately, it is jam-packed with falsehoods because you have to think to yourself, if you're going back to Tokyo after having lost 4 aircraft carriers in an afternoon, there's going to be a little explaining that has to go on. And
Roger.
So basically what ends up happening is that the staff members of First Air Fleet kind of put together a bit of a tall tale in terms of what actually happened to them. And after the war, when Nagumo is dead, Fujita kind of makes him the fall guy and puts out this book that, basically puts all of the myths that have been in place on this battle on the table, not only about Midway, but also about Pearl Harbor and things in the Indian Ocean and yada, yada, yada.
Interesting. Personality worth a lot of study and reflection and some
for sure.
Breathing through your nose as you read about it. On the U.S. side, the 2 key leaders on slide 10, obviously, are Admirals King and Nimitz. And again, I'm giving you impossible tasks and a brief. We know their relationship wasn't great. King thought initially that Nimitz was kind of timid. It seems like, having met 2 months before in San Diego, that they had a better relationship. But talk to us about the importance of these guys and their relationship for the battle and then subsequently.
King was, the commander of the entire fleet and just an absolute blowtorch of an individual.
Worked for them.
Just an abrasive, harsh, but extremely bright strategist, I think. And when he sends Nimitz out to take over command of the Pacific Fleet after Admiral Kimmel is, removed in disgrace after Pearl Harbor, Nimitz does take a little while to kind of get his feet underneath him. He is not a timid individual, but, there's a lot of pieces that need to be picked up here relatively rapidly. And King is concerned that Nimitz is not being aggressive enough. Just before the battle in mid-April, the 2 of them meet in San Francisco, and we don't have a good record of exactly what was said during that meeting, but it seems clear that Nimitz was able to convince his boss, I got this. just
Yeah.
back off and let me do my thing. We're going to be able to manage this thing. So,
and I can't tell you I can tell you, so I will tell you how important that is,
how does
because
that work?
I had an experience of leading a large wing in combat during the air war over Serbia. And I had a boss who was a tough boss, whom I had not known until a couple months prior when I took command of the wing. But he trusted me and basically said, "Go do this." And but for that, it would have not just been miserable, it would have been very difficult to be successful. If you're looking over your shoulder or you're making decisions that are then countermanded, I can't imagine this. So this April meeting in San Diego may have been the moment you'd most likely to witness in person. I don't know.
Yeah, that would have been really, really interesting. And you have to bear in mind too that at the same time, King is under enormous pressure because
Oh, yeah.
German U-boats are shooting up the east coast of the U.S. and the Brits are, breathing down his neck, and rightly. So again, the first 6 months of this war are disastrous for us, and so King has taken heat from all sorts of different quarters. He needs to know that his guy in the Pacific has got this thing because he hasn't got the cycles to run it himself.
So when we get down to the tactical level, next slide, please. Two characters, I included a couple of annotations on this. Fletcher had previously been a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Okay, the standard, the criteria for awarding those may change over. I don't think that matters. The Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. And then Admiral Spruance later became a U.S. ambassador. These are remarkable men in their own right.
Yep.
How about assessing their relationship and role at Midway?
Well, Fletcher, does not often get as much credit for this victory as he ought. A lot of people forget that he fought 3 carrier battles during the early part of 1942, Coral Sea, Midway, and Eastern Solomons off of Guadalcanal, and he won all 3 of them and extracted, 6 enemy carriers for 2 of his own. But he was he was a very mild-mannered guy. I think he got sort of shuffled unfairly off the stage after the beginning stages of Guadalcanal and kind of receded into the background, never commanded a fleet at sea again. Spruance was his subordinate, and yet Spruance gets the lion's share of the credit for this battle. Spruance is running Task Force 16, which has 2 carriers. Fletcher is just running the Yorktown. Spruance, a very analytical, some would say a cold fish, just a man completely driven by his intellect, and also a surprise choice for command. Halsey, Admiral William Halsey, should have been in overall command of this operation.
Right.
Halsey had gotten a case of the shingles, and into the hospital he went. And he designated Spruance as, this is the guy who I want in command of my task force. So they put Spruance in. So an interesting pair for what shaped up to be an extremely important battle.
Let me, before we move on to the next 2 characters in our drama, say to all of you who submitted questions, the moderators or the folks handling the questions have told you they've been passed on to us. We will get to them. And especially for Andrea, who's watching with her elementary age children, please ask them to hang on. We'll get to it. It's a great question.
All right.
So the next pair, and this is probably if you asked people on the street what they know about the Battle of Midway, they'd mention the water plant at AF.
Right.
Because it's prominently featured, and it has to do with code breaking that was led by Roquefort, but the credit was taken by Admiral Redmond in Washington. First time that has ever happened, by the way, where Washington usurped credit. Tell us more, because this is a fascinating interpersonal drama. And did we have to confirm that the Japanese target was Midway, or was that who were we proving it to?
Roquefort was absolutely convinced on the basis of all sorts of different pieces of evidence that the code name AF was in fact Midway. The reason we sent that that message to Midway to, hey, you know, transmit and clear that your salinization plant has broken down, had nothing to do with, you know, assuring Roquefort that it was all a game to play against Washington to say, look, we know what we're doing here, and AF actually is Midway. There's a bureaucratic struggle going on between these two men. Ultimately, Roquefort has the right answer, but he's going to end up losing that struggle and lose his job when the Redmonds, the two brothers, end up kicking him out.
And I'd say it's, you know, when we say bureaucratic, it's as tactical in some ways as the operations. The two organizations have different priorities and requirements. I've been in this circumstance on both sides, at the theater level and in Washington, D.C. And there's natural friction there that can't be avoided. But what's interesting is the personal nature that it takes on between Redmond and Roquefort, and the ultimate negative impact on Roquefort.
Yep.
So, wow, that's a heck. Another could be a movie just about that relationship. So, if we look at the timeline of the battle itself on slide 13, just to set the table for more questions, this shows it starting at 6:30. Really, it starts about 4 in the morning, right, when the first Japanese strike launches?
Yeah, the first strike is launched at 04:28 in the morning. And so this battle, as you can see, goes on all day long. And that's a reflection of the fact that, again, at the point of the tip of the spear, these two forces are relatively evenly matched. So it's a real slugging match. It's not until about dinner time, around 5 p.m., that Hiryu is finally bombed and put out of action. And that's essentially the end of the battle.
And so the movies that have been made about often portray a split second. There's a split second. This is a long battle.
Yeah.
And both sides are engaged in frantic combat operations, whether they're actually launching or striking or not, for a full day. And there's some action beyond that, beyond the end of the day. And that's striking to me. At what point, now I'm going to ask you to speculate, John, and I'm going to ask you. So at what point do you think Nagumo and the Japanese begin to think this might not end well?
That's a really good question. And you know, then the follow-on question to that is, you know, when do they find?
I'm afraid John's locked up. Oh no.